Please begin the next chapter at the top of page 45 in your book.
The camp looked as though it had suffered an epidemic, empty and dead. There were just a few well-clad prisoners walking about between the blocks. Of course, we had to go through the showers first. The head of our camp joined us there. He was a strong, well-built, broad-shouldered man, bull neck, thick lips, frizzled hair. He looked kind. A smile shone from time to time in his gray-blue eyes. Our convoy included a few children, 10 and 12 years old. The officer took an interest in them and gave orders for them to be brought food. After we had been given new clothes, we were installed in 2 tents. We had to wait to be enlisted in the labor units, then we could pass into the block. That evening, the labor units came back from the work yards. Roll call. We began to look for familiar faces, to seek information, to question the veteran prisoners about which labor unit was the best, which block one should try to get into. The prisoners all agreed, saying, "Buna's a very good camp. You can stand it. The important thing is not to get transferred to the building unit." As if the choice were in our own hands. The head of our tent was a German, an assassin's face, fleshy lips, hands like a wolf's paws. He was so fat he could hardly move. Like the leader of the camp, he loved children. As soon as we arrived, he had brought them bread, soup, and margarine. Actually, this was not disinterested affection. There was a considerable traffic in children among homosexuals here, I learned later. The head told us, "You're staying here 3 days in quarantine. Then you're going to work. Tomorrow, medical inspection." One of his assistants, a hard-faced boy with hooligan's eyes, came up to me. "Do you want to get into a good unit?" "I certainly do, but on one condition. I want to stay with my father." "All right," he said. "I can arrange that for a small consideration. Your shoes. I'll give you some others." I refused to give him my shoes. They were all I had left. "I'll give you an extra ration of bread and margarine." He was very keen on my shoes, but I did not give them up to him. Later on, they were taken from me just the same, but in exchange for nothing this time. Medical examination in the open air in the early hours of the morning before 3 doctors seated on a bench. The first barely examined me at all. He was content merely to ask, "Are you in good health?" Who would have dared to say anything to the contrary? The dentist, on the other hand, seemed most conscientious. He would order us to open our mouths wide. Actually, he was not looking for decayed teeth, but gold ones. Anyone who had gold in his mouth had his number added to a list. I myself had a gold crown. The first 3 days passed by rapidly. On the 4th day at dawn, when we were standing in front of the tent, the capos appeared. Then each began to choose the men who suited him. You, and you." They pointed a finger as though choosing cattle or merchandise.
Okay, Elie and his father have been moved to another part of Auschwitz, a forced labor camp called Buna. As they try to adjust to their new surroundings, they have a hard time figuring out how to obey orders and avoid trouble. The head of the camp seems to treat his fellow prisoners pretty well. He makes sure that the children are getting food. But one thing Elie has discovered is that people aren't always as kind as they seem. No one in power can be trusted. Only 2 things matter: staying with his father and surviving. Elie and his father will be assigned to a group of workers, but first they are checked out by the camp doctors. If they can't convince the doctors that they're healthy, they'll be put to death. The dentist, meanwhile, is only interested in Elie's gold tooth, which is worth some money to the Nazis. I worry that the gold tooth will be yanked from Elie's mouth, which will cause him a huge amount of pain. Let's continue on page 47 with the sentence beginning, "We followed our capo."
We followed our capo, a young man. He made us stop at the entrance to the first block near the door of the camp. This was the orchestra block. "Go in," he ordered. We were surprised. What had we to do with music? The band played a military march, always the same one, dozens of units left for the workyards in step. The capos beat time, left, right, left, right. Some SS officers, pen and paper in hand, counted the men as they went out. The band went on playing the same march until the last unit had gone by. Then the conductor's baton was still. The band stopped dead, and the capos yelled, "Form fives!" We left the camp without music, but in step. We still had the sound of the march in our ears. Left, right, left, right. We started talking to the musicians next to us. We drew up in ranks of 5 with the musicians. They were nearly all Jews. Juliek, a bespectacled Pole with a cynical smile on his pale face. Louis, a distinguished violinist who came from Holland. He complained that they would not let him play Beethoven. Jews were not allowed to play German music. Hans, a lively young Berliner. And the foreman was a Pole, Franek, a former student from Warsaw. Juliek explained to me, "We work in a warehouse for electrical equipment not far from here. The work isn't the least difficult or dangerous, but Edek, the capo, has bouts of madness now and then when it's best to keep out of his way." "You're lucky, son," smiled Hans. "You've landed in a good unit." 10 minutes later, we were in front of the warehouse. A German employee, a civilian, the Meister, came to meet us. He paid us about as much attention as a dealer might who was just receiving a delivery of old rags. Our comrades had been right. The work was not difficult. Sitting on the ground, we had to count bolts, bulbs, and small electrical fittings. The capo explained to us at great length the vast importance of our work, warning us that anyone found slacking would have him to reckon with. My new comrades reassured me. "There's nothing to be scared of. He has to say that because of the Meister." There were a number of Polish civilians there and a few French women who were casting friendly glances at the musicians. Franek, the foreman, put me in a corner. "Don't kill yourself. There's no hurry. But mind, an SS man doesn't catch you unawares." "Please, I would have liked to be by my father." "All right, your father will be working here by your side." We were lucky. There were 2 boys attached to our group, Yossi and Tibi, 2 brothers. They were Czechs whose parents had been exterminated at Birkenau. They lived body and soul for each other. They and I very soon became friends. Having once belonged to a Zionist youth organization, they knew innumerable Hebrew chants. Thus we would often hum tunes evoking the calm waters of Jordan and the majestic sanctity of Jerusalem. And we would often talk of Palestine. Their parents, like mine, had lacked the courage to wind up their affairs and emigrate while there was still time. We decided that if we were granted our lives until the liberation, we would not stay in Europe a day longer. We would take the first boat for Haifa. Still lost in his Kabbalistic dreams, Akiba Drumer had discovered a verse in the Bible, which, interpreted in terms of numerology, enabled him to predict that the deliverance was due within the coming weeks.
Compared to some of the other prisoners, Elie and his father are lucky. They are assigned to an electrical warehouse outside the camp where the work isn't too difficult or dangerous. They work side by side. Polish civilians, which means people who are neither prisoners nor soldiers, are also working there. These are people who live in nearby towns and get paid for their labor. But the Jews get no money for their work. They must take orders from the Meister, the German civilian who runs the warehouse. Elie becomes friends with 2 brothers, Yossi and Tibi. The boys' parents were murdered in Birkenau, and they comfort themselves by singing Hebrew songs and dreaming of a day when the war will end. Elie also dreams of escaping Europe for a new life in Palestine, which, remember, is the Jewish Holy Land in the Middle East, where Elie once encouraged his father to take the family, back when they were still living in Siget. Elie wonders whether he will live to see Palestine's holy cities, Haifa and Jerusalem. Once he was a student of the Kabbalah, but now Elie looks down on the Kabbalah follower, Akiba Drumer. Elie knows that Drumer's dreams of God saving the Jews of Auschwitz are not going to come true anytime soon. Let's continue from the top of page 49 with, "We had left the tents."
We had left the tents for the musicians' block. We were entitled to a blanket, a wash bowl, and a bar of soap. The head of the block was a German Jew. It was good to be under a Jew. He was called Alphonse, a young man with an extraordinarily aged face. He was entirely devoted to the cause of his block. Whenever he could, he would organize a cauldron of soup for the young ones, the weak, all those who were dreaming more about an extra plateful than of liberty. One day, when we had just come back from the warehouse, I was sent for by the secretary of the block. "7713? "That's me." "After eating, you're to go to the dentist." "But I haven't got a toothache." "After eating, without fail." I went to the hospital block. There were about 20 prisoners waiting in a queue in front of the door. It did not take long to discover why we had been summoned. It was for the extraction of our gold teeth. The dentist, a Jew from Czechoslovakia, had a face like a death mask. When he opened his mouth, there was a horrible sight of yellow, decaying teeth. I sat in the chair and asked him humbly, "Please, what are you going to do?" "Simply take out your gold crown," he replied, indifferently. I had the idea of pretending to be ill. "You couldn't wait a few days, doctor? I don't feel very well. I've got a temperature." He wrinkled his brow, thought for a moment, and took my pulse. "All right, son. When you feel better, come back and see me, but don't wait until I send for you." I went to see him a week later with the same excuse. I still did not feel any better. He did not seem to show any surprise, and I do not know if he believed me. He was probably glad to see that I had come back of my own accord as I had promised. He gave me another reprieve. A few days after this visit of mine, they closed the dentist's surgery and he was thrown into prison. He was going to be hanged. It was alleged that he had been running a private traffic of his own in the prisoner's gold teeth. I did not feel any pity for him. I was even pleased about what had happened. I had saved my gold crown. It might be useful to me one day to buy something, bread or life. I now took little interest in anything except my daily plate of soup and my crust of stale bread. Bread, soup, these were my whole life. I was a body, perhaps less than that even, a starved stomach. The stomach alone was aware of the passage of time.
Okay, in this section, Elie is brought to the dentist's office so his gold tooth can be removed. But he makes up a story about being sick, and the dentist, who is a Jew from Czechoslovakia, decides not to pull out the tooth just then. Later, the dentist is put in prison and is going to be hanged. Rumor has it he was trading with prisoners' gold teeth. Elie does not care, and in fact, he's pleased. Now he can keep his tooth and maybe trade it someday for food or to save his life. Elie says that he is only a body now, and I think what he means is that the needs of his body are all he can think about. He is so hungry that he can think only of eating his daily bread and soup. He does not have the energy to be interested in anything else. Let's continue after the space on page 50, with the sentence beginning, "At the warehouse."
At the warehouse, I often worked next to a young French girl. We did not speak to one another since she knew no German and I did not understand French. She seemed to me to be a Jewess, though here she passed as Aryan. She was a forced labor deportee. One day, when Edek was seized with one of his fits of frenzy, I got in his way. He leapt on me like a wild animal, hitting me in the chest, on the head, throwing me down and pulling me up again, his blows growing more and more violent until I was covered with blood. As I was biting my lips to stop myself from screaming with pain, he must have taken my silence for defiance, for he went on hitting me even harder. Suddenly, he calmed down. As if nothing had happened, he sent me back to work. It was as though we had been taking part together in some game where we each had our role to play. I dragged myself to my corner. I ached all over. I felt a cool hand wiping my blood-stained forehead. It was the French girl. She gave me her mournful smile and slipped a bit of bread into my hand. She looked into my eyes. I felt that she wanted to say something but was choked by fear. For a long moment she stayed like that. Then her face cleared and she said to me in almost perfect German, "Bite your lip, little brother. Don't cry. Keep your anger and hatred for another day, for later on. The day will come, but not now. Wait. Grit your teeth and wait." Many years later in Paris, I was reading my paper in the metro. Facing me was a very beautiful woman with black hair and dreamy eyes. I had seen those eyes before somewhere. It was she. "You don't recognize me?" "I don't know you." "In 1944, you were in Germany, at Buna, weren't you?" "Yes." "You used to work in the electrical warehouse." "Yes," she said, somewhat disturbed. And then, after a moment's silence, "Wait a minute. I do remember. Edek, the capo, the little Jewish boy, your kind words." We left the metro together to sit down on the terrace of a cafe. We spent the whole evening reminiscing. Before I parted from her, I asked her, "May I ask you a question?" "I know what it will be. Go on." "What?" "Am I Jewish?" "Yes, I am Jewish. From a religious family. During the occupation, I obtained forged papers and passed myself off as an Aryan. That's how I was enlisted in the forced labor camps. And when I was deported to Germany, I escaped the concentration camp. At the warehouse, no one knew I could speak German. That would have aroused suspicions. Saying those few words to you was risky, but I knew you wouldn't give me away."
Did you understand what this section was all about? At the electrical warehouse, Elie befriends a French girl whom he suspects is Jewish. It's not until years after the war, when they run into each other on a train in France, that he learns her true story. The girl explains that when the war began, she was a Jew living with her family in France. In 1940, the Nazis invaded the country. A new French government was set up that helped out the Germans. This period was called the Occupation because the Nazis eventually occupied all of France. The Jews of France were sent to death camps just like Jews all over Europe. The French girl pretended she was an Aryan, a non-Jew, to escape this horrible fate. Instead of being sent to a death camp, she was put in a work camp and sent to the electrical warehouse in Buna. Let's continue on page 52 with "Another time we had to load."
Another time we had to load diesel engines onto trains supervised by German soldiers. Edek's nerves were on edge. He was restraining himself with great difficulty. Suddenly, his frenzy broke out. The victim was my father. "You lazy old devil!" Edek began to yell. "Do you call that work?" And he began to beat him with an iron bar. At first my father crouched under the blows. Then he broke in two like a dry tree struck by lightning and collapsed. I had watched the whole scene without moving. I kept quiet. In fact, I was thinking of how to get farther away so that I would not be hit myself. What is more, any anger that I felt at that moment was directed not against the capo, but against my father. I was angry with him for not knowing how to avoid Edek's outbreak. That is what concentration camp life had made of me. Franek, the foreman, one day noticed the gold-crowned tooth in my mouth. "Give me your crown, kid." I told him it was impossible, that I could not eat without it. "What do they give you to eat anyway?" I found another answer. The crown had been put down on a list after the medical inspection. This could bring trouble on us both. If you don't give me your crown, you'll pay for it even more. This sympathetic, intelligent youth was suddenly no longer the same person. His eyes gleamed with desire. I told him I had to ask my father's advice. Ask your father, kid, but I want an answer by tomorrow. When I spoke to my father about it, he turned pale, was silent for a long while, and then said, "No, son, you mustn't do it. He'll take it out on us." "He won't dare." But alas, Franek knew where to touch me. He knew my weak point. My father had never done military service, and he never succeeded in marching in step. Here, every time we moved from one place to another in a body, we marched in strict rhythm. This was Franek's chance to torment my father and to thrash him savagely every day. Left, right, punch! Left, right, clout! I decided to give my father lessons myself, to teach him to change step and to keep to the rhythm. We began to do exercises in front of our block. I would give the commands, left, right, and my father would practice. Some of the prisoners began to laugh at us. "Look at this little officer teaching the old chap to march. Hey, General, how many rations of bread does the old boy give you for this?" But my father's progress was still inadequate, and blows continued to rain down on him. "So you still can't march in step, you lazy old devil?" These scenes were repeated for 2 weeks. We could not stand any more. We had to give in. When the day came, Franek burst into wild laughter. "I knew it! I knew quite well I would win! Better late than never! And because you've made me wait, that's going to cost you a ration of bread. A ration of bread for one of my pals, a famous dentist from Warsaw, so that he can take your crown out." "What? My ration of bread so that you can have my crown?" Franek grinned. "What would you like then? Shall I break your teeth with my fist?" That same evening in the lavatory, the dentist from Warsaw pulled out my crowned tooth with the aid of a rusty spoon. Franek grew kinder. Occasionally he even gave me extra soup. But that did not last long. A fortnight later, all the Poles were transferred to another camp. I had lost my crown for nothing.
Elie and his father are suffering so much in the concentration camp that it's making them do things they never would have done back home in Siget. Edek, the capo in charge of the electrical warehouse, picks on Elie's father because he's too weak to fight back. As Elie watches Edek hitting his father with an iron bar, he realizes it's not Edek he's angry at, it's his father for getting himself in trouble and letting himself be hurt like this. Elie wonders what has become of himself, that he would turn his anger on his own father. Later, Elie tries to teach his father to march so that Franiek, the guy who's in charge at the warehouse, will stop hitting him. The marching lessons are humiliating and bizarre. Can you imagine the old, studious Elie and his dignified father doing something like this? The two of them make such a crazy picture that other prisoners begin to laugh at them. And in the end, the lessons don't work, and Elie is forced to give up his gold tooth and a ration of bread to save his father from further beatings. Let's continue reading after the space on page 54 with "A few days before the Poles left."
A few days before the Poles left, I had a new experience. It was Sunday morning. Our unit did not need to go to work that day, but all the same, Edek would not hear of our staying in the camp. We had to go to the warehouse. This sudden enthusiasm for work left us stunned. At the warehouse, Edek handed us over to Franek, saying, "Do what you like, but do something. If not, you'll hear from me." And he disappeared. We did not know what to do. Tired of squatting down, we each in turn went for a walk through the warehouse, looking for a bit of bread some civilian might have left behind. When I came to the back of the building, I heard a noise coming from a little room next door. I went up and saw Edek with a young Polish girl half naked on a mattress. Then I understood why Edek had refused to let us stay in the camp. moving 100 prisoners so that he could lie with a girl. It struck me as so funny that I burst out laughing. Edith leapt up, turned around, and saw me while the girl tried to cover up her breasts. I wanted to run away, but my legs were glued to the ground. Edith seized me by the throat. Speaking in a low voice, he said, "You wait and see, kid. You'll soon find out what leaving your work's gonna cost you. You're gonna pay for this pretty soon. And now go back to your place." Half an hour before work usually ended, the capo collected together the whole unit. Roll call. Nobody knew what had happened. Roll call at this time of day? Here? But I knew. The capo gave a short speech. "An ordinary prisoner has no right to meddle in other people's affairs. One of you does not seem to have understood this. I'm obliged, therefore, to make it very clear to him once and for all." I felt a sweat run down my back. "A7713. I came forward. "A box," he ordered. They brought him a box. "Lie down on it, on your stomach." I obeyed. Then I was aware of nothing but the strokes of the whip. 1, 2. He counted. He took his time between each stroke. Only the first ones really hurt me. I could hear him counting. 10, 11. His voice was calm and reached me as though through a thick wall. 23. 2 more, I thought, half conscious. The capo waited. 24. 25. It was over, but I did not realize it, for I had fainted. I felt myself come round as a bucket of cold water was thrown over me. I was still lying on the box. I could just vaguely make out the wet ground surrounding me. Then I heard someone cry out. It must have been the capo. I began to distinguish the words he was shouting. "Get up!" I probably made some movement to raise myself because I felt myself falling back onto the box. How I longed to get up. "Get up!" he yelled more loudly. If only I could have answered him, at least. If only I could have told him that I could not move. But I could not manage to open my lips. At Edic's command, 2 prisoners lifted me up and led me in front of him. "Look me in the eye." I looked at him without seeing him. I was thinking of my father. He must have suffered more than I did. "Listen to me, you bastard," said Edic coldly. "That's for your curiosity. You'll get 5 times more if you dare tell anyone what you saw. Understand?" I nodded my head once. 10 times I nodded ceaselessly as if my head had decided to say yes without ever stopping. One Sunday, when half of us, including my father, were at work, the rest, including myself, were in the block, taking advantage of the chance to stay in bed late in the morning. At about 10 o'clock, the air raid sirens began to wail. An alert. The leaders of the block ran to assemble us inside while the SS took refuge in the shelters. As it was relatively easy to escape during a warning, the guards left their lookout posts and the electric current was cut off in the barbed wire fences. The SS had orders to kill anyone found outside the blocks.
One Sunday when Elie is resting and his father is working in the warehouse, air raid sirens suddenly go off. This means that the Allies, soldiers from England, the United States, and other countries that are fighting against Germany in the war, are planning to drop bombs on the Nazis from airplanes, somewhere near the labor camp. The SS soldiers run and hide in places that are safe from the bombs. This means that no one is guarding the lookout posts, but the prisoners know better than to try to escape because they will be shot immediately if anyone sees them. So, will the Allies succeed in bombing the Nazis and freeing the prisoners? Let's find out. Keep reading toward the bottom of page 56, starting with Within a few minutes,
the camp looked like an abandoned ship. Not a living soul on the paths. Near the kitchen, 2 cauldrons of steaming hot soup had been left half full. 2 cauldrons of soup right in the middle of the path with no one guarding them. A feast for kings, abandoned, supreme temptation. Hundreds of eyes looked at them, sparkling with desire. 2 lambs with 100 wolves lying in wait for them. 2 lambs without a shepherd. A gift. But who would dare? Terror was stronger than hunger. Suddenly, we saw the door of Block 37 open imperceptibly. A man appeared, crawling like a worm in the direction of the cauldrons. Hundreds of eyes followed his movements. Hundreds of men crawled with him, scraping their knees with his on the gravel. Every heart trembled, but with envy above all. This man had dared. He reached the first cauldron. Hearts raced. He had succeeded. Jealousy consumed us, burned us up like straw. We never thought for a moment of admiring him, poor hero, committing suicide for a ration of soup. In our thoughts, we were murdering him. Stretched out by the cauldron, he was now trying to raise himself up to the edge. Either from weakness or fear, he stayed there, trying, no doubt, to muster up the last of his strength. At last he succeeded in hoisting himself onto the edge of the pot. For a moment he seemed to be looking at himself, seeking his ghost-like reflection in the soup. Then, for no apparent reason, he let out a terrible cry, a rattle such as I had never heard before, and, his mouth open, thrust his head toward the still steaming liquid. We jumped at the explosion. Falling back onto the ground, his face stained with soup, the man writhed for a few seconds at the foot of the cauldron. Then he moved no more. Then we began to hear the airplanes. Almost at once the barracks began to shake. "They're bombing Buna!" someone shouted. I thought of my father, but I was glad all the same to see the whole works go up in fire. What revenge! We had heard so much talk about the defeats of German troops on the various fronts, but we did not know how much to believe. This, today, was real. We were not afraid, and yet if a bomb had fallen on the blocks, it alone would have claimed hundreds of victims on the spot. But we were no longer afraid of death. At any rate, not of that death. Every bomb that exploded filled us with joy and gave us new confidence in life. The raid lasted over an hour. If it could only have lasted 10 times 10 hours. Then silence fell once more. The last sound of an American plane was lost in the wind, and we found ourselves back again in the cemetery. A great trail of black smoke was rising up on the horizon. The sirens began to wail once more. It was the end of the alert. Everyone came out of the blocks. We filled our lungs with the fire and smoke-laden air, and our eyes shone with hope. A bomb had fallen in the middle of the camp near the assembly point, but it had not gone off. We had to take it outside the camp. The head of the camp, accompanied by his assistant and the chief capo, made a tour of inspection along the paths. The raid had left traces of terror on his face. Right in the middle of the camp lay the body of the man with the soup-stained face, the only victim. The cauldrons were taken back into the kitchen. The SS had gone back to their lookout posts behind their machine guns. The interlude was over. At the end of an hour, we saw the units come back in step as usual. Joyfully, I caught sight of my father. "Several buildings have been flattened right out," he said, "but the warehouse hasn't suffered." In the afternoon, we went cheerfully to clear away the ruins. A week later, on the way back from work, we noticed in the center of the camp at the assembly place a black gallows.
For 1 hour, bombs from Allied airplanes rained down on the camp. The prisoners are happy because they hope that the bombs will destroy the camp and kill the Nazis. Elie says he doesn't even mind if one of the bombs kills him, too. Better, he says, to die that way than to be killed by the Nazis. But after an hour passes, the air raid ends without destroying the camp or freeing the prisoners. The SS soldiers are as powerful as before. They shoot and kill a starving Jew who dared to take extra soup from a pot near the kitchen. Then they set up a gallows, a place where people are hanged. This means that the Nazis are going to hang someone to death with a rope. Let's find out why. Continue reading near the bottom of page 58. We're on the sentence beginning, We were told that soup
would not be distributed until after roll call. This took longer than usual. The orders were given in a sharper manner than on other days, and in the air there were strange undertones. "Bare your heads!" yelled the head of the camp suddenly. 10,000 caps were simultaneously removed. "Cover your heads!" 10,000 caps went back on to their skulls as quick as lightning. The gate to the camp opened. An SS section appeared and surrounded us, one SS at every 3 paces. On the lookout towers, the machine guns were trained on the assembly place. "They fear trouble," whispered Juliek. 2 SS men had gone to the cells. They came back with a condemned man between them. He was a youth from Warsaw. He had 3 years of concentration camp life behind him. He was a strong, well-built boy, a giant in comparison with me. His back to the gallows, his face turned toward his judge, who was the head of the camp. The boy was pale, but seemed more moved than afraid. His manacled hands did not tremble. His eyes gazed coldly at the hundreds of SS guards, the thousands of prisoners who surrounded him. The head of the camp began to read his verdict, hammering out each phrase. "In the name of Himmler, prisoner number, stole during the alert, according to the law, paragraph, prisoner number is condemned to death. May this be a warning and an example to all prisoners." No one moved. I could hear my heart beating. The thousands who had died daily at Auschwitz and Birkenau in the crematory ovens no longer troubled me. But this one, leaning against his gallows, he overwhelmed me. "Do you think this ceremony will be over soon? I'm hungry," whispered Juliek. At a sign from the head of the camp, the lager capo advanced toward the condemned man. 2 prisoners helped him in his task for 2 plates of soup. The capo wanted to bandage the victim's eyes, but he refused. After a long moment of waiting, the executioner put the rope round his neck. He was on the point of motioning to his assistants to draw the chair away from the prisoner's feet when the latter cried in a calm, strong voice, "Long live liberty! A curse upon Germany! A curse! A curse!" The executioners had completed their task. A command cleft the air like a sword. "Bare your heads!" 10,000 prisoners paid their last respects. "Cover your heads!" Then the whole camp, block after block, had to march past the hanged man and stare at the dimmed eyes, the lolling tongue of death. The capos and heads of each block forced everyone to look him full in the face. After the march, we were given permission to return to the blocks for our meal. I remember that I found the soup excellent that evening.
Let's go over this last section. Thousands of prisoners were ordered to come to the camp's main square. There, SS soldiers with machine guns forced them to watch the hanging of a Polish boy who stole food during the air raid. After the boy is hanged, the prisoners are forced to walk past the gallows and stare into his eyes. Why do you think the Nazis are making such a show of this one boy's death when they seem to beat and kill people every day? I think they want the boy's death to be an example to the other prisoners. They want all of the prisoners to feel as horrible as Elie feels watching this boy. They want the prisoners to feel that their lives are meaningless and powerless and can be ended at any time for any reason. Let's finish the chapter, starting after the space on page 60 with, "I had witnessed other hangings."
I witnessed other hangings. I never saw a single one of the victims weep. For a long time those dried-up bodies had forgotten the bitter taste of tears. Except once. The Oberkapo of the 52nd Cable Unit was a Dutchman, a giant well over 6 feet. 700 prisoners worked under his orders, and they all loved him like a brother. No one had ever received a blow at his hands, nor an insult from his lips. He had a young boy under him, a people, as they were called, a child with a refined and beautiful face, unheard of in this camp. At Buna, the people were loathed. They were often crueler than adults. I once saw one of 13 beating his father because the latter had not made his bed properly. The old man was crying softly while the boy shouted, "If you don't stop crying at once, I shan't bring you any more bread! Do you understand?" But the Dutchman's little servant was loved by all. He had the face of a sad angel. One day, the electric power station at Buna was blown up. The Gestapo, summoned to the spot, suspected sabotage. They found a trail. It eventually led to the Dutch Oberkapo, and there, after a search, they found an important stock of arms. The Oberkapo was arrested immediately. He was tortured for a period of weeks, but in vain. He would not give a single name. He was transferred to Auschwitz. We never heard of him again. But his little servant had been left behind in the camp and prison. Also put to torture, he too would not speak. Then the SS sentenced him to death, with 2 other prisoners who had been discovered with arms. One day, when we came back from work, we saw 3 gallows rearing up in the assembly place. 3 black crows. Roll call. SS all round us, machine guns trained, the traditional ceremony. 3 victims in chains, and one of them, the little servant, the sad-eyed angel. The SS seemed more preoccupied, more disturbed than usual. To hang a young boy in front of thousands of spectators was no light matter. The head of the camp read the verdict. All eyes were on the child. He was lividly pale, almost calm, biting his lips. The gallows threw its shadow over him. This time, the Lagerkapo refused to act as executioner. 3 SS replaced him. The 3 victims mounted together onto the chairs. The 3 necks were placed at the same moment within the nooses. "Long live liberty!" cried the 2 adults. But the child was silent. "Where is God? Where is he?" someone behind me asked. At a sign from the head of the camp, the 3 chairs tipped over. Total silence throughout the camp. On the horizon, the sun was setting. "Bare your heads!" yelled the head of the camp. His voice was raucous. We were weeping. "Cover your heads!" Then the march past began. The 2 adults were no longer alive. Their tongues hung, swollen, blue-tinged. But the 3rd rope was still moving. Being so light, the child was still alive. For more than half an hour, he stayed there, struggling between life and death, dying in slow agony under our eyes. And we had to look him full in the face. He was still alive when I passed in front of him. His tongue was red. His eyes were not yet glazed. Behind me, I heard the same man asking, "Where is God now?" and I heard a voice within me answer him. Where is he? Here he is. He is hanging here on this gallows. That night, the soup tasted of corpses.
Elie ends this chapter by describing another tragic hanging. This time, the victim is a pipel, a frail young boy working as a capo's assistant in one of the factories. When somebody blows up a power station at Buna, the Gestapo torture the capo and the pipel to get them to confess to the crime or tell who did it. But neither will talk, and the pipel is hanged in the main square of Buna. Everyone is horrified as the boy chokes and suffocates for an hour before dying. Elie feels as though God himself is being hanged on the gallows. I think maybe he believes that only in a world where God is dead could a child be killed in such a horrible way. Once, Elie's faith in God was the most important thing in his life. But in the camps, that faith is being tested in ways that you and I can't even imagine. Let's start the next chapter on page 63.
The summer was coming to an end. The Jewish year was nearly over. On the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the last day of that accursed year, the whole camp was electric with the tension which was in all our hearts. In spite of everything, this day was different from any other. The last day of the year. The word last rang very strangely. What if it were indeed the last day? They gave us our evening meal, a very thick soup, but no one touched it. We wanted to wait until after prayers. At the place of assembly, surrounded by the electrified barbed wire, thousands of silent Jews gathered, their faces stricken. Night was falling. Other prisoners continued to crowd in from every block, able suddenly to conquer time and space and submit both to their will. What are you, my God? I thought angrily, compared to this afflicted crowd proclaiming to you their faith, their anger, their revolt? What does your greatness mean, Lord of the universe, in the face of all this weakness, this decomposition, and this decay? Why do you still trouble their sick minds, their crippled bodies?
Okay, it's the end of summer. Elie and his father were deported in April, so they've been at Auschwitz for about 5 months. It's also the evening before Rosh Hashanah, or the Jewish New Year. Rosh Hashanah, which is Hebrew for first of the year, is a very holy day. It's a time when Jews think about the sins they've committed in the past year, asking God to forgive them, so they can make a clean start. But can you imagine how terrible it must be for the Jews at Auschwitz to think back on the events of the past year? And how can they think about what they'll do differently when they have no control over their lives, when they've done nothing to deserve their punishment, and when they don't even know whether they'll live to see another year? It's the constant fear of death that makes the idea of celebrating the Jewish New Year seem so strange and awful to them. Let's continue from the third paragraph on page 63 with, "They gave us our evening meal."
10,000 men had come to attend the solemn service, heads of the blocks, capos, functionaries of death. Bless the Eternal. The voice of the officiant had just made itself heard. I thought at first it was the wind. Blessed be the name of the Eternal. Thousands of voices repeated the benediction. Thousands of men prostrated themselves like trees before a tempest. Blessed be the name of the Eternal. Why, but why should I bless him? In every fiber I rebelled. Because he had had thousands of children burned in his pits, because he kept 6 crematories working night and day on Sundays and feast days, because in his great might he had created Auschwitz, Birkenau, Buna, and so many factories of death. How could I say to him, Blessed art thou, eternal, Master of the universe, who chose us from among the races to be tortured day and night, to see our fathers, our mothers, our brothers end in the crematory. Praised be thy holy name, thou who hast chosen us to be butchered on thine altar. I heard the voice of the officiant rising up, powerful, yet at the same time broken, amid the tears, sobs, the sighs of the whole congregation. All the earth and the universe are God's. He kept stopping every moment, as though he did not have the strength to find the meaning beneath the words. The melody choked in his throat. And I, mystic that I had been, I thought, yes, man is very strong, greater than God. When you were deceived by Adam and Eve, you drove them out of paradise. When Noah's generation displeased you, you brought down the flood. When Sodom no longer found favor in your eyes, you made the sky rain down fire and sulfur. But these men here, whom you have betrayed, whom you have allowed to be tortured, butchered, gassed, burned, what do? They pray before you. They praise your name. All creation bears witness to the greatness of God. Once, New Year's Day had dominated my life. I knew that my sins grieved the Eternal. I implored his forgiveness. Once, I had believed profoundly that upon one solitary deed of mine, one solitary prayer, depended the salvation of the world. This day I had ceased to plead. I was no longer capable of lamentation. On the contrary, I felt very strong. I was the accuser, God the accused. My eyes were open, and I was alone, terribly alone, in a world without God and without man, without love or mercy. I had ceased to be anything but ashes. Yet I felt myself to be stronger than the Almighty, to whom my life had been tied for so long. I stood amid that praying congregation, observing it like a stranger. The service ended with a Kaddish. Everyone recited the Kaddish over his parents, over his children, over his brothers, and over himself. We stayed for a long time at the assembly place. No one dared to drag himself away from this mirage. Then it was time to go to bed, and slowly the prisoners made their way over to their blocks. I heard people wishing one another a happy New Year. I ran off to look for my father, and at the same time I was afraid of having to wish him a happy New Year when I no longer believed in it. He was standing near the wall, bowed down, his shoulders sagging as though beneath a heavy burden. I went up to him, took his hand, and kissed it. A tear fell upon it. Whose was that tear? Mine? His? I said nothing, nor did he. We had never understood one another so clearly. The sound of the bell jolted us back to reality. We must go to bed. We came back from far away. I raised my eyes to look at my father's face leaning over mine, to try to discover a smile or something resembling one upon the aged, dried-up countenance. Nothing. Not the shadow of an expression. Beaten. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Should we fast? The question was hotly debated. To fast would mean a surer, swifter death. We fasted here the whole year round. The whole year was Yom Kippur. But others said that we should fast simply because it was dangerous to do so. We should show God that even here, in this enclosed hell, we were capable of singing his praises. I did not fast, mainly to please my father, who had forbidden me to do so. But further, there was no longer any reason why I should fast. I no longer accepted God's silence. As I swallowed my bowl of soup, I saw in the gesture an act of rebellion and protest against him. And I nibbled my crust of bread. In the depths of my heart, I felt a great void.
Now the prisoners are celebrating another Jewish holiday, Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, which is an important day just after the Jewish New Year. On Yom Kippur, the Jews atone, or make up for sins they've committed in the past year. During this day, most Jews don't work, and they fast, which means they go without food. But how can Elie and the other prisoners fast? They are practically starving already, and to turn down what little food they are given might make them very ill or kill them. Elie's father forbids him to fast, and as Elie eats his soup and bread, he feels he is breaking a religious law and rebelling against God. But Elie feels no guilt about doing this because he blames God for punishing innocent Jews. He even dares to say that men are better than God because they keep praying in spite of their suffering in the camps. Let's keep reading after the space on page 66, starting with, "The SS gave us..."
The SS gave us a fine New Year's gift. We had just come back from work. As soon as we had passed through the door of the camp, we sensed something different in the air. Roll call did not take so long as usual. The evening soup was given out with great speed and swallowed down at once in anguish. I was no longer in the same block as my father. I had been transferred to another unit, the building one, where 12 hours a day I had to drag heavy blocks of stone about. The head of my new block was a German Jew, small of stature, with piercing eyes. He told us that evening that no one would be allowed to go out after the evening soup. And soon a terrible word was circulating: selection. We knew what that meant. An SS man would examine us. Whenever he found a weak one, a Muselmann, as we called them, he would write his number down, good for the crematory. After soup, we gathered together between the beds. The veteran said, "You're lucky to have been brought here so late. Oh, this camp is paradise today compared to what it was like 2 years ago. Buna was a real hell then. There was no water, no blankets, less soup and bread. At night we slept almost naked, and it was below 30 degrees. The corpses were collected in hundreds every day. The work was hard. Today, this is a little paradise. The capos had orders to kill a certain number of prisoners every day, and every week. Selection. A merciless selection. Yes, you're lucky." "Stop it! Be quiet!" I begged. "You can tell your stories tomorrow or on some other day." They burst out laughing. They were not veterans for nothing. "Are you scared?" So were we scared, and there was plenty to be scared of in those days. The old men stayed in their corner, dumb, motionless, haunted. Some were praying. An hour's delay. In an hour, we should know the verdict: death or a reprieve. And my father? Suddenly I remembered him. How would he pass the selection? He had aged so much.
Elie has learned the terrible news that there will be a selection at Buna. Remember back when Elie and his father first arrived at Birkenau, and the German officer Dr. Mengele decided which prisoners would live or die with a single wave of his stick? Well, that's what a selection is, and one is about to begin now. The prisoners will be inspected, and those who are too sick, too old, or too weak to work will be selected to be killed and burned in the ovens. Elie is worried about his father, whose health has gotten worse and worse since he entered the camps. But the fact that it takes Elie a few minutes to even remember his father, who was once the only thought in his mind, shows how much life in the camp has changed Elie and taken away the things that make him human. Suffering has turned him into a machine whose only thoughts now are of food, water, and survival. Let's continue reading from the middle of page 67, where it says, "The head of our block..."
The head of our block had never been outside concentration camps since 1933. He had already been through all the slaughterhouses, all the factories of death. At about 9 o'clock, he took up his position in our midst. Achtung! There was instant silence. Listen carefully to what I am going to say. For the first time, I heard his voice quiver. In a few moments, the selection will begin. You must get completely undressed. Then, one by one, you go before the SS doctors. I hope you will all succeed in getting through, but you must help your own chances. Before you go into the next room, move about in some way so that you give yourselves a little color. Don't walk slowly. Run. Run as if the devil were after you. Don't look at the SS. Run straight in front of you. He broke off for a moment, then added, "And the essential thing, don't be afraid." Here was a piece of advice we should have liked very much to be able to follow.
You're at the end of this disc. Please insert disc 4 into your CD player and begin reading at the top of page 68.